Senator Rubio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Dubowitz, I want to start. Here's the central argument that we're being given, okay? There exist these sanctions in the world today. They're going to go away as part of this deal, the U.S. sanctions, the international sanctions. If Congress somehow rejects this deal, then one of two things is going to happen. Number one, the sanctions are still going to go away internationally, and Iran will then, I've just heard, is going to continue to enrich. But if that happens, under that scenario, if in fact the rest of the sanctions stay in place around the world, but Iran violates the terms of the deal, then by the very definition of the deal, the sanctions would be reimposed again, would they not?
Correct.
And so therefore, this argument that somehow if we walk away from the deal, this guarantees that sanctions go away and that Iran moves forward on a nuclear weapon is absurd.
Correct.
Because what they're basically arguing is that the rest of the world isn't serious about sanctions. They want to do business with Iran no matter what, whether they comply or they do not comply. Here's the second argument I reject, and I would be interested in having your input on it, and that is that somehow without the rest of the world, the sanctions are irrelevant. And yet it is my understanding that the U.S. sanctions are the biggest piece of the sanctions in place that have the greatest impact. For example, imagine for a moment if you're a German bank, and you now must choose to have either access to the U.S. economy or access to the Iranian economy. Which one, in your mind, are they going to choose?
U.S. economy.
In fact, my understanding is the U.S. economy represents close to 50% of the flow of capital in the world. Iran is probably less than 1% of that. I can't imagine any entity on the planet, especially in the banking sector, deciding we would still rather have access to the Iranian market and somehow cut ourselves off of the rest of the world. Why I find this all absurd is this idea that somehow the U.S. must now do this because the rest of the world would be really upset at us. The last time I checked, this country saved the world on at least 2 occasions in the last century. I don't remember the last time the world saved America. And so my point is that we are called to lead on this matter. And I just think that this argument that somehow these sanctions, the whole thing collapses, if all the sanctions that will be irrelevant if somehow America isn't a part of this deal, doesn't make any sense to me. It just doesn't. Because in my mind, if you're the Europeans and the rest of the world, you've agreed to lift sanctions on Iran in exchange for specific behavior on their part. If they no longer comply with that behavior because they're upset that America walked away, then by definition, their own sanctions should kick in again. Am I wrong in my assessment of this? Or?
Senator Rubio, you're not wrong because people are trying to have it both ways, as you've suggested. But I'd like to suggest one other reason why you're right, and it's a technical reason, and it gets back to the SWIFT sanctions. To understand this, the Europeans are not going to allow Iranian banks back onto SWIFT. If the United States retains secondary financial sanctions on international institutions doing business with those Iranian banks and retains U.S. secondary sanctions on SWIFT. So even in your scenario, and the Europeans provide, quote unquote, all of that relief, the one thing that I believe they will not do is readmit 46 Iranian banks, including the Central Bank of Iran, back onto SWIFT as long as U.S. financial sanctions remain in place. Because the 10,000 banks around the world, plus, that actually use SWIFT, are not going to do business with those Iranian banks that have been readmitted onto SWIFT if our U.S. financial sanctions still remain in place. So the most powerful sanction that we've imposed, that Congress imposed, which were the SWIFT sanctions, will remain intact even if the Europeans are upset with us, because fundamentally thousands of financial institutions around the world are not going to do business with Iranian banks on SWIFT.
I also want to, as a point of comparison, think back to the North Korean negotiations. As I recall, Mr. Burns, I think you were at the State Department during this time, so maybe when the negotiations were going on with North Korea about their deal, my recollection is that the countries in the region most impacted by it, the Japanese and the South Koreans, were at the table. In fact, that they were part of that process. Isn't that correct?
There were 2 negotiations. There was the agreed framework of '94, President Clinton, and there was President Bush's negotiations in 2007 and 8. I was not involved in either one, but I'm more familiar with the second, with President Bush.
But in both instances, both the Japanese and the South Koreans, neighbors of North Korea, were in favor. In fact, they both supported the agreements and the process that was in place. They felt that was a better alternative to the direction that everything else was going at the time.
Certainly in 2007 and 8, the Japanese and South Koreans were part of the 6-party talk framework with North Korea.
So what does it say about this negotiation that while it's great that the P5+1, these European powers, the Chinese, the United States are at the table, none of the nations most directly impacted by the Iranian threat, meaning none of our Arab allies, not Israel, none of them are at the negotiating table. None of them were involved in this process, and quite frankly, in the case of Israel, they oppose it, and in the case of many of our Arab allies, while they use polite diplomatic language to describe it, there is no enthusiasm in the Arab world for this deal.
Well, the reason why the P5 was a negotiating entity, that was a decision made by the Bush administration. I was part of that in 2005 and 2006. We felt it was important to get the permanent 5 countries in Germany, the major powers, to face Iran across the table. And I would say that the consequences of the United States walking away, and that was the issue that you were talking to Mr. Dubertz about, I think the real world consequences will be, if we walk away, that the Europeans won't be with us because they agree with this deal. And Iran will be strengthened, Senator, if we walk away, and the sanctions will dissipate and the restrictions will fall, which leads me to support the administration's agreement.
Great, I want to touch on that point, but let me go back one step further before that, and that is, what does it say that none of the countries in the region that are most directly impacted by Iran's threat immediately are not enthusiastic about it, as opposed to the way the Japanese and the South Koreans were, even though that didn't work out? In essence, isn't it concerning that the nations that know Iran the best, who live next door to them, are in fact not enthusiastic about this deal? Shouldn't that alone tell us something about this deal and about its construct?
Well, first I'd say we absolutely have to focus on American interests here first and an American perspective all the time. Second, I think that the opinion in the Arab world is very much divided on this. There are some who oppose it. There are some who will support it if we also be tough-minded in pushing back against the Iranians and the Iranian use of conventional force in the region. Certainly Israel is adamantly opposed to this. You're right about that.
Okay, so then going back to the point that you raised a second ago, and that is, I still don't understand this argument. So the Europeans have lifted sanctions, and they're going to lift sanctions on Iran with or without us, right? At this point.
They have not lifted sanctions yet, and
but
they won't until we do, once Iran, if it does, implement.
So if Congress rejects this deal, the Europeans are going forward. We'll be at it alone, as Secretary Kerry has said. They're moving forward. The other nations, the other 5 are moving forward, and the International Security Council and the European community are all going to move forward to lift the sanctions with or without us if we reject this, correct?
Absent some surprise development,
okay,
some revelation about Iran's activities, I think that's correct that the Europeans and the Chinese and Russians will go ahead.
Right.
But they'll go ahead in lifting sanctions.
Right.
But then the restrictions on Iran's program would be lifted because the agreement would fall apart.
And that's what I don't understand. So what you're saying is that Europeans and these other countries are willing to say, we're going to lift the sanctions with or without you, and if Iran decides then to violate the deal because America walked away, we're still going to lift the sanctions.
No, the practical consequence would be if we walked out unilaterally,
right,
and turned on a dime against the agreement the administration has just negotiated, the practical consequence of that is that the deal would effectively not be in force. So Iran would have the dual benefit of new trade with the rest of the world and yet no restrictions. And that's the problem.
But why would they have that dual benefit? Why would the rest of the world allow Iran to get away with violating the deal they signed with them too?
So I am obviously here not to defend the rest of the world. I'm just trying to interpret behavior.
Right.
And I used to be part of these negotiations on behalf of the Bush administration. We're in a situation, I think, where if we walk away, the consequence of this will be that no one will be supporting us, and therefore the ultimate winner will be Iran. Iran's going to be strengthened and will be in a weaker position.
I just don't understand that argument, because the argument basically is...
It's real-world diplomacy.
Yeah, but it's not. What it basically is saying is these countries, no matter what happens, they're lifting sanctions because they want to do business in Iran. And it'll be great if Iran complies with the deal. It'll be really great if the U.S. is part of it, because then it guarantees in their mind that Iran will comply with the deal. But no matter what, even if Iran violates this deal that they've made with the rest of the countries, it doesn't matter, because we're lifting sanctions no matter what. That tells me why it is then that we should not tie our foreign policy to countries that have already made a decision that they're interested in doing business in Iran and they're willing to live with a nuclear Iran. That's what it sounds like to me, if you're saying that in the real world they're willing to accept violations of sanctions, violations of the deal, and still leave the sanctions off.
No, I wouldn't interpret my own views that way. I'd just say this, and we were talking with the chairman about this before. The way, as I understand this, I'm not part of the administration, this deal has been constructed. The United States has obligations, if Iran implements the deal, that we have to fulfill, including
we have obligations if the
listing
U.S.
of
Congress
sanctions.
supports it.
And so therefore, if the U.S. walks away unilaterally and the other parties have honored the agreement, I think Iran emerges tactically strengthened. I don't want to see that, which is one reason I support this agreement.
Well, if Iran doesn't honor its agreement, then Europe shouldn't honor its part of the agreement either. And that's what you're saying is going to happen unless we're part of it. And I just don't understand that. But